All right, gardening 101. All right.
Do you have it in presenter mode, by the way? So it's just your whole screen.
Yeah, hold on. You guys can see that too.
That's fine. We'll leave it.
All right, we're gonna leave it. Okay, cool. So gardening 101, we're gonna go through just some of like the basic requirements and like fundamentals of like what you need to know about like growing vegetables, as well as like the different types of vegetable gardening and like the pros and cons of each one, which hopefully would be able to help you like figure out what kind of gardening or gardening you might want to pursue. So why we're focusing on this, especially for like our first academic TBM, is garden education is a really important aspect of like what we're trying to do with Doug. A lot of our mission and the way that we're like approaching food insecurity revolves around teaching people how to garden and giving them and working with them to like create more accessibility to the materials to have your own garden, and then also know how to grow your own food. So it's kind of like putting the agency like back on the individual, and instead of having to rely on like a community garden or other outside sources. Also just getting people familiar with terms and general practices. I know everyone here isn't like totally about the gardening aspect of things or doesn't have a lot of experience. So this is a great time to just kind of like get some base knowledge. And so we also just want everyone to kind of be relatively knowledgeable at these topics. So when we do eventually start moving to building beds for individual people and organizations and other entities outside of us, being able to like kind of know about these things or know about like the basics of a garden will be really valuable. So to start out, the basics of growing vegetables. Shout out, oh, look at Aaliyah and Rafa holding those collards that are literally
that was
like
our first day.
It is insane. These are the beautiful garden and some produce in the community fridge that we had. Okay, so I tried to come up with an acronym for all of these, but I could not because they had like literally all consonants. But sunlight, water, healthy soil, seeds, location, pest control, and space are really some of the most important components when you're trying to grow vegetables. So starting off with sunlight, it seems very basic, but just to give you like a frame of mind, most vegetable plants need at least 6 hours, usually about 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight every day. And direct sunlight, obviously when you're outside, is just sunlight that goes directly to the plant, or indoors, like for container gardening, that would like go through a window directly onto the plant. Indirect is when the light like bounces off something before hitting the plant. So as far as like allocating like where in your garden or which plants get sunlight, like maybe allocating leafy greens and certain like more cold weather crops is a better strategy if you have like areas of your garden that like aren't as sunny. And so yeah, picking your location is key, which we'll get into a little bit further later on. Water is also like a super basic and essential component to vegetable gardening, but the like specifics of which aren't always well known. And so consistency is key with watering. Regardless, like there can be some fluctuations as far as like what you're growing and like how much it needs, but as long as you like figure that out and are on like a consistent schedule, then your plants will at least have that to kind of like build off of. So when you first like go to plant vegetables, like whether it be seeds or seedlings, for the first 2 weeks that they're in the ground, you go through what is called establishment watering, which is a period where basically every other day for the first 2 weeks, either they're getting watered. Seeds, you kind of do like a shower head method where like the top photo, it's like more of a spray instead of like a jet, and you're kind of just like misting the seeds so that they're like damp, but not like super disturbed, versus like seedlings are more like divoted and they get like a healthier like, soap. And then after the 2 weeks, we go into maintenance watering, which is again, the frequency and volume depends on the crop, but it's usually around like 1 to 2 or 3 times per week. Drainage is also an important component when you're thinking about watering vegetable plants, because without proper drainage, we get wet soil, which leads to wet roots, which leads to root rot, which is really not good for your plants and won't give you the yield that you want. And so either using like raised bed gardening, raised beds to like create more drainage, or especially like caring for the health of your soil to make sure it's really well aerated and water is able to like pass through it, or some sort of collection, is very important. Our garden has an irrigation system, which we're very lucky to have, so we don't have to do like manual watering after our establishment waterings are finished. That is a luxury, and that like not everyone can have, so we're very lucky for that. And that leads me into, so soil, I feel like, at least for my personal gardening experience, was something that like I overlooked and didn't think was very important. Like I feel like we often hear about how to make the plant thrive. But the soil and the health of your soil is really important to having healthy vegetable plants. So there are like 3 kind of primary particles that soil is basically like a combination of like rocks that have broken down over time, organic materials, and like microorganisms that like kind of help consolidate it all together. So the 3 types of particles would be like sand, silt, and clay, which kind of represent like a spectrum of like textures and like levels of like wetness and dryness, and like the size of the particles. And so ideally your soil would be like an equal balanced ratio of these 3 types of particles. And like the term for like really healthy, balanced soil is called loam, which was a new term I learned, but I've heard that before and didn't know. So like that's like garden definitions. Or loamy is also, you can use it as an adverb. That's cool. Some key minerals are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And there's different ways of seeing like of adding different materials that will like kind of contain these. Each nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium has like a specific purpose, whether that be like supporting like early plant development or like really strong like stems and leaves. And depending on like which you, I guess, require, you can make up for that in like certain fertilizers or different like soil amendments. Organic matter is a really important component of healthy soil, that like sticks, leaves, and compost that can be added, and it's important, I guess, to be like mixing that in, both like in the off seasons of your garden and also like throughout as needed. Also keeping the soil loose, about like 8 to 12 inches down, to have like good oxygen flow. Make sure your roots are aerated, again, not getting like too wet, and the roots have like room and like the texture they need to kind of spread out and thrive. Microorganisms are super important in soil, just for like breaking down organic matter, and just like also aerating the soil and just creating a really healthy environment for your plants. And so our vermiculture program, we are actually raising worms that hopefully one day we'll be able to transport like to our garden to enhance our soil in that way. Soil pH is also a key important of soil that I'm very new to. So if anyone has more information about that, please jump in and share. But the ideal soil pH for vegetable gardening is about like 6 to 7. And depending on like the soil pH is indicative basically of like the minerals and nutrients available in the soil, and then like the plant's ability to like use and absorb them. And so like if your soil is too acidic or too basic, there are different additives that you can use to kind of balance that pH and get something ideal. And a lot of like, you can get your soil tested for pH, and I think it is pretty expensive, but a lot of like college extension programs like Penn has like a Penn extension program that does like a lot of like of gardening classes and programming, and so they usually will do it for free or at like a very high discount, which is awesome. And so moving right along into fertilizer. So every garden, again, is different, and like every crop is different. Like what it needs is going to fluctuate. And so fertilizer is basically applied to address like different nutrient deficiencies in your crops or your garden, or to quickly boost growth. And so like this one's a little more harder to give like generalized advice about, because it is kind of like touch and go and subjective to the situation. Like again, if like a plant is like has a lot of like dead matter, or it isn't growing in the rate that it should be, then like you probably need to fertilize it maybe a bit more frequently. Or if a plant is doing really, really well, you can probably space out your fertilizing, like your periods, a bit more. So it's a little bit touch and go with that. And there's 3 main types of fertilizer. We've got like dry, which is just like, and you can see in the picture, like either like a powder or pebble thingies that you can like sprinkle within your garden. And these are helpful because you can either like spread it all over the garden, or if you need to like localize your fertilizer like to one row or one plant, you can just put it right around there, and it doesn't really like totally affect the whole bed. So that's kind of nice. There's also water soluble fertilizers, which are particularly helpful for container gardening, because for container gardening, you're working with like a much smaller, like a pot usually, instead of like a large piece of land. And so like for when you're fertilizing container gardens, it's more, you want to like dilute the fertilizer because it's a smaller area, like the fertilizer doesn't have as much space like to dissipate. And so it helps to have the water soluble ones to kind of have that like flexibility. And that can be as frequently as once a week, but also can be a lot more spaced out. And then animal manures are the third option for fertilizers, like aged animal manures. And I will, like, just a word of caution, there is like definitely a too little, but there is also like a too much for fertilizer. And there are different like symptoms of like both like nutrient deficiencies and like nutrient like poisonings almost from like having so much or such like a large concentration. I won't totally get into all of the specifics because honestly, like each one of these components could be like an entire presentation on its own. Like I could literally do a whole thing just about fertilizers. So I'm trying to keep it general, but like also not overwhelm. Again, please stop me if you have any questions at all or would like to add anything. And so coming back to soil health, soil in the off season, which is particularly relevant to us because we are about to enter our first winter where we're not growing stuff, or at least in my experience with this garden, my first winter. And so for soil health in the off season, it's kind of like it's an off season. It's like a really good time for your soil to like recuperate and kind of get recharged and ready for spring. And so usually the protocols are removing the crops, of course, and cutting them at the base of the soil. So like you're leaving like the roots in so they kind of can hold some of the soil secure and some of the nutrients like as they should be, and not to like disturb it too much. So there's nothing really to like keep it stabilized. And then also like adding some organic matter like compost or aged manure. We'll be using the compost that we've been cooking at the garden for months now. Ideally, like your compost would be making up like about a fourth of like the overall soil mix. But so in the fall, probably in like the next couple weeks, once we clear out our crops, we're going to be adding like 2-3 layers of compost on top of each bed, and then kind of letting that let that sit. And then you can cover like in the context of raised beds, you can cover with like either like leaves or wood chips, like a way of like mulching for the winter, or it can weigh like down like a plastic sheet or like a cloth cover, cardboard pieces, or like rug scraps for the purpose of like preventing like really uncontrollable weed growth. And then also like the soil compaction from like heavy rains or like elements kind of like pushing everything down. And kind of just like leaving the bed alone to sit and do its thing and just let the microorganisms work, as well as like leaving weeds alone until early spring, like before you're getting ready to plant, when you would be like uncovering the bed, starting to integrate the compost back into the soil, and then starting to weed. And then moving on now to seeds. Seeds, pretty basic and pretty like up for interpretation. You can pretty much pick whatever you want as long as it's kind of within the season in which it's supposed to be planted, or is like the season in which it's supposed to be planted, as well as like taking into account where you live, like where in the world, where in the country, because different zones around the country have different like climates and weather patterns and like dates in which like certain vegetables can thrive. And so knowing that is important to like choosing your seeds. And so yeah, of course, like picking seeds that you would like to eat and that like you that you like to eat. You want to grow stuff that you will actually consume. There's a ton of planting calendar resources that I like mentioned earlier through like the Farmer's Almanac, and we're going to be releasing like a whole resource guide after this with like links to various things if you want to learn more about any of these specific topics. But also seeds can be a really great way to do pest repellent as well. Like if you're strategically picking, you can actually pick certain seeds to like to combat or like prevent certain pests, which is like a really cool way to kind of customize that aspect of seeds.
Piggybacking off of Maddie, it's definitely good to know when you are planting something, what season you're supposed to grow it in, and like how to do that. There are some plants, for example, like if you grow something with a squash or a zucchini plant, there are some plants that thrive in low light and can, grow and thrive underneath the squash plant. So it's really good to pick and choose what's really compatible. And an easy way to do that is to actually look at the back of the seed packets. Although it sounds self-explanatory, there's a lot on the back of a seed packet that you might not know. So there's, at least in this diagram, there's a lot more than you might see on most seed packets, but the average information. It's the seed name or the seed variety. It could also be called the cultivar, which is, it'll give you the basic name. So say it's, in this case, it's dill, and then the cultivar is underneath the Long Island, right? And continuing off of that. And then it might have it in Latin if you want like the actual like classification and species name of the plant. But it's really important to actually know what kind of plant you're having, because there are a lot of variations. Say you have like poppy seeds, but it's for the East Coast, and then there's California poppy seeds. And so you're growing a plant that's meant for like hot weather on the East Coast where it's cold. So it's very important to actually know what kind of plant you're growing, because the picture is very misleading. It could say cabbage on it, and it might not be the right cabbage that you want. The hardiness zone map, Maddie, if you want to switch frames and then come back, is something that's really important. That like colorful map that you saw at the bottom left corner, that essentially is like the average temperature or the climate of any given region. So if you look on the map, we're kind of in that small yellowish greenish area on the top right at the bottom of Pennsylvania. So you kind of circle there. So we have a mixed climate zone or a hardiness zone, and each of the classifications have numbers. So I believe we're 7, right, Maddie, or something along those lines.
Yeah,
so
70.
Okay. So if we are in a certain hardness zone, then you can't really grow crops that can't handle that temperature. Continuing on, if you want to go back a slide, Maddie. Continuing on, these next ones are kind of be rapid fire because they're pretty self-explanatory, but they'll be back to, it's the one before it, sorry. You're good. So it would be for how to sow. Maddie, go one more.
Yeah.
One forward. We definitely rehearsed this.
My mouse don't work.
Yeah, we definitely rehearsed this.
Good?
Yeah, you're perfect.
All right.
But the how to plant is going to be this big long description on how to actually sow your seeds, and then it'll normally give you a table for the germination time, where how long it takes from going to a seed to a seedling or a sprout, the depth of sowing, so how deep in the ground you're supposed to be planting those seedlings or seeds when you do plant them, the seed spacing, how far apart each seed could be, and then the row spacing if you're planting them in lines. Like we have raised beds, so we're going to be planting in rows. Certain plants need a lot of space between each other because they just grow to be ginormous and then will cover each other and compete for sunlight, which is not fun. And then also thinning is another important process. If you are a new gardener, it's really good to just kind of sprinkle seeds and hope that some grow. It increases your success rates. But for a lot of gardeners, once they learn the thinning process and how easy it is to actually germinate their seeds, they'll go and they'll cut out or they'll pick certain sprouts out just so they have a limited amount. So say you planted 20 seeds, 15 grew, and you only needed like 10, those 5 you'll just take out and you'll either, move somewhere else or get rid of them entirely. And then average days to harvest, it'll just give you an estimate of how long it should take, whether it's a couple weeks to a couple months to actually start harvesting crops for it. And then the sell by date, seeds can expire. So please, before you pick out a packet, make sure you read the expiration date, because sometimes people get away with selling expired seeds and it's not fun, because then your seeds won't grow and it'll be very upsetting. And then the extra info is going to be anything from the company name, the company that kind of packaged the seeds, or where you got it from. It could be also the website. Normally these companies have websites that like, here's more information. They'll tell you more about the seeds. But yeah. And then there's some more information that this diagram doesn't exactly have. So now, Maddie, you can go to the other slide after the hardiness map. Yeah. There you go. Just fixing on mine.
Dude, this is like tweaking. All right.
Is it okay? Is your mouse not working?
I don't even know. I don't know.
Yeah. And then the last two things, most seed packets might not have this, but there are some that do, and it's good to like know this. But there are specific labels called accreditations where it'll give you specific information about what kind of seeds you have. So for some of them, you'll have like certified organic, and this is like a USDA designated seeds that were grown like without chemicals, completely organic. Fair trade is just something that's packaged in a responsible manner that can be used for like cross-continental trade, and just the general prices are from the producer. So that's not really one to worry about. Non-GMOs are just more so the more original natural plants that you have. They're not really modified in any way. And then heirloom or open pollinate, you'll see these a lot. They're just the straight species. They've always been grown that way. There's no crossbreeding, nothing like that. They're just the originals. So I've done this a lot, at least from my experience. If you look up like how to grow a tomato from your grocery store one, it'll most likely say you can't do that. You need an heirloom tomato. That's because, at least this goes into the next point, the hybrid crops a lot of supermarket crops are hybrid. So if you take the seeds from them, you'll most likely get a mix or diverse crop that's not the same, because these seeds are bred together to have the most desired traits. So heirloom is what you want if you want the way the grocery ones look. Hybrid is something if you want to try and see what random assortments come out. So if you grow a tomato from your supermarket, it might come out like a dark brown and a yellow, and then they're all different sizes because they're not the same. And then the type is mainly just the growing season. So annual is like, oh, excuse me. Annuals are the ones that grow for a season and usually die off. Biannuals are 2 seasons, maybe more. They'll bloom and they'll regrow. It's kind of more so, it might grow longer, it might not. And then you might see the words like hardy or half hardy. Hardy is just another word that says that these plants can withstand frost, so you can grow them over like colder seasons. So right now we have hardier plants, which are mostly leafy greens or radishes or spinaches. They can just kind of take the frost a bit more than anything else. And then the tender plants are ones that just can't, they're too delicate for cold weather. They will die immediately if they touch a colder temperature. So these are really important, just because if you want to start your garden and you want to be ballsy like I am and start something in the cold, you need to know what's too delicate for the cold. I like to start crops indoor, so that's just me. But it's more of an experiment, and it's about understanding your crop so you can get the best yield out of it.
Right on. Thank you, Leah. And yeah, okay, so moving on to location. We got so there's a lot of things to consider, I guess, when you're trying to pick a location for a garden. If you're setting one up like outside, indoors, like it's not as big of a deal. But like we said, considering sunlight, the distribution, and like how your crops are going to fit into that, if they're okay with shade or not, drainage, but like whether that be like how you structure your garden or like the type of garden you choose to do, depending on like how the land slopes, how it all works, or like what kind of natural drainage exists in the garden that you're trying to have, as well as like relatively stable, and like in the sense that like people aren't like walking on it all the time, like maybe absent from like foot traffic and not like extra, like very much exposed to winds, if possible. I know you can't always have everything. Nutrient rich soil, if you're gardening in the ground, it's not a requirement, but like having to like make soil into more like into fertile soil, if it's like at a poor starting place, is a very like lengthy process. So that's always nice to have. And as far as size, if you're just starting out with an outdoor garden, usually like a 10 by 10 foot, if for like a like in-ground garden, is pretty much the max for like someone just starting out, or like a 4 by 4 or 4 by 8 like raised garden bed. Our beds at the garden are 4 feet by 11 feet, I'm pretty sure. And so we have 14 of those, so that's like a much bigger scale. But there's still lots to learn in like the individual beds. And so yeah, again, where you live for your location, determining like again, Philly's like USDA hardness zone 7B, so that comes with the whole like requirements as far as like when you're deciding where to plant your garden, and like the timing of everything. And we got pest control. It's funny to me to like speak on this, because our garden this year definitely went through the ringer with pests. We had so many trial and error experiences, but it was really helpful. White flies. So you can kind of go 3 routes with pest control: natural, synthetic, or manual. So natural would just be like planting certain crops that like are natural pest repellents, like marigolds, lavender, basil. There's like certain crops you can plant to prevent certain pests. If you have like in Philadelphia, at least at our garden, we struggle with white flies, aphids, and cabbage loopers specifically. And so targeting those in particular is important. Synthetic would be like chemical insecticides or fungicides. This one on the right is what we use. It is organic and it's non-toxic to humans. And so that's the one that we choose to use. It's a little bit more expensive, and just synthetic pest control options in general will be more expensive. Then you have manual, which is just like going through the garden yourself. If you have like a 1 bed, that's like, you could probably like swing that, and if you can like check it consistently. But like for our garden, we tried doing that and it did not work. It is just like too much work, even for a large group of people. Next up, space. Aside from like the location, the actual like spacing of your plants need enough room to be able to grow and like collect enough resources. Again, depending on the seed packet, as like Aaliyah laid out, it'll tell you like very clear details of how to space your plants. It can be anywhere from 1 inch apart to 3 feet apart. as well as if you're going to be having like perennial plants, which are plants that live for like more than 2 years, you want to make sure that you're just being aware that that space is going to be occupied for that long. And so just like kind of taking into account if you have plants of like different lengths, like how that space allocation is going to work out in relation to like how you're transitioning between seasons. Also, like again, saving shaded areas for cold weather crops, and companion planting is also something to consider. This isn't something that I know a whole lot about, and isn't something that we've done a ton with at the garden. But companion planting, basically like planting certain plants together, interplanting that have like a symbiotic relationship or benefit each other and work well together, kind of as a way to like benefit both. That is something to consider when you're laying out your garden. Okay, so that is, again, to summarize, sunlight, water, healthy soil, seeds, location, pest control, and space. Those are like the key ingredients for gardening. I really wish I had an acronym. That would be sick. But if any of you can come up with one, you can get a prize or something. All right, so now I'm just gonna take us real quick through some of the main types of gardening, and just like the pros and cons of each that maybe will help you like figure out what you're trying to do if you would like to start a garden. So in-ground gardening, again, just gardening like in the ground, in the soil. It's pretty cost effective. You don't need a whole lot of materials to get it off the ground. Just like, I mean, garden maintenance tools to till the soil. It is a little labor intensive when you're having to like till the soil, like take out all the sod and like make it fertile. Like it's definitely like a time intensive process, but it is relatively easy because you don't have like the barrier of like having to get materials and like do this, and this. But the cons, good soil, like good natural soil is really hard to come by, especially like in Philadelphia. There's a lot of like heavy metals and especially like lead in our soil. And so it's like, it's really hard, especially in cities, to find like good soil that I personally would feel comfortable gardening in. So raised beds can be a good option or alternative. Weeds can be the number one enemy. Again, you're not like controlling all of the soil that goes into your garden like how you would in a raised bed. And so like that can be a bit unpredictable, as well as it can be a little bit wasteful as far as like water. It's definitely one of the like more like unsustainable methods, I guess, of gardening, compared to some of the alternative ones that we'll get into later. Just because it's a large plot of land, there's more area for the water to disperse into, so it requires just more. As well as like tilling the soil can sometimes really disturb the life of like the ecosystem of worms and just like soil the life and ecosystem in general. So that can be a little harmful. Wood chip gardening is just like a variation kind of in-ground gardening, but you're like basically putting like wood chips or mulch kind of in like a thick layer on top of your in-ground garden beds and like around the plants. And this is cool because it helps like retain moisture in the soil, and like protects the soil from being like compacted and from being compacted. It also like kind of keeps weeds at bay because they have a lot more to push through. But on the other side, it makes it a lot harder for like seeds and seedlings to really like push up out of it, especially for seeds if they're just growing from that. Oh no, see, it's weird. I like move my cursor and the whole thing just goes like crazy. But yeah, so that's another variation of in-ground gardening. Hydroponics is basically using just a growing medium, like a liquid nutrient solution, to basically grow plants. So it's kind of taking soil out of the equation. Not for like, I think some hydroponics, I don't know if actually some hydroponics use soil or not, but most of them do not, and that makes them pretty unique. In my research for the presentation, I learned that hydroponics is actually the fastest growing gardening method. Plants actually grow like 20% faster than like their soil counterparts, and they yield 25% more produce than like soil gardening, which is crazy. And like I think one of the biggest pros is that it's just really sustainable because again, it's like it's using this nutrient solution. It doesn't take all of like the resources, like all the input of water, like soil, all of these components that are like cost and like resource intensive. It's also really space efficient, as you can see, like this really cool one on top, like you can get in a really large space a ton of plants growing. So like going forward into the future, I think like it'll be interesting to see how like ponics in general kind of evolve and like move into like industrial like agriculture and stuff. I think it'll be interesting. You can also grow indoors and outdoors, which is awesome. But again, it can be expensive to set up, but we are trying to explore some options to like get people to be making their own systems for cheap. Again, indoor lights can be pricey, synthetic fertilizers can be pricey, and there isn't a lot of organic options just using like those fertilizers. Aaliyah, you want to hit on aquaponics because that's your baby?
Yeah, I can. Aquaponics is my baby, and essentially piggybacking off of hydroponics, aquaponics is using all the principles of hydroponics, using controlled mediums, controlling all the nutrients that goes in your media, in your liquid substrate, and then just adding aquaculture, which is just fish farming. And essentially it uses all of the waste produced by your fish. So it could be anything from goldfish, from tetras to tilapia to catfish. It can be on a really huge industrial level where you can actually farm the fish and use them for protein. But all the nutrients you put in, you feed the fish, that waste gets turned into essentially food for the plants. It filters through the system and just kind of gets broken up, not really like filtered out chemically. And then the chemicals are used to feed the plants filter out the water, and then, excuse me, and then it gets cycled back down into the system where the fish are housed. Oh my goodness, my throat is dying. Sorry. But yeah, some of the pros, it obviously conserves water. It's a closed system. It just is contained. Whatever you put in stays in there, unless it's an outdoor system where obviously evaporation can happen, but it's not really you constantly pumping water through a system like you would a garden where it's an open area. It's not really you controlling the water. It's soilless, so you don't really have to worry about, like Maddie said, controlling all of the pHs, all the fertilizers, all the nutrients that you want in the soil, when you can just do that by adding drops of certain chemicals into it. And again, it's just a different way of doing hydroponics. Also, aeroponics is a variation of hydroponics where instead of using just liquid substrate, it's misting the roots, just kind of in those same vertical style pipes and just misting it instead. And you could also grow multiple foods at once. It doesn't just have to be leafy greens. It doesn't have to just be herbs. In my experience, we grew watermelons on a vertical wall and then tomatoes in a float bed at the same time. And then we raised tilapia on top of that. And that was a big cultivated feast that we had afterwards. But again, cons with all of these systems is that they're super expensive, at least if you want the industrial scale, if you want the prettier versions. But if you're interested, we are researching and looking into methods to make it cheap versions. All you really need is a fish tank and then something like non-toxic foam and a pump, and you can kind of get it started. But if you really want to get into it, really want all of the nitty gritty, you have to invest a lot of money into it. And at least for the bigger systems, it's a lot of space because you need to house the fish. It's not just you compensating for the plants, which hydroponics, kind of makes up for it. You can just grow plants in its small space. Fish need a lot of attention. Fish need a lot of space. They're very needy. And if you want both to thrive, you need to keep both happy. So, yeah. Maddie, you're muted. I don't know if you just complaining about the scrolling again.
Okay, I couldn't figure out how to get unmuted. Bro, it's been a while since I've been on Zoom. I'm not gonna lie, guys.
Yeah, that's what happens when we switch to Discord.
Fine. Yeah, right. Yeah, aquaponics is really awesome. Just the sustainability aspect is so cool. But yeah, so hopefully we can get a really cool system where we're doing aquaculture and like actually being able to like raise and use fish for food eventually. But we're definitely still in our pilot right now, which is really, really exciting. So then raised beds, this is the method that we use at our community garden. It's really fun. First of all, you can paint the beds, so that kind of makes it superior in all ways. But actually, some of the pros of raised bed gardenings is that it elevates the soil, which kind of, again, as I kind of mentioned earlier in the presentation, just helps with drainage. And it's nice because you get to control kind of like the soil that you're choosing to put into your beds. And so you can kind of like create an environment from the get-go. It also reduces the strain on the back if you're someone that has mobility issues. 4 of our beds are actually double decker, which I've spent a lot of time in that garden, and that actually does help quite a bit. You wouldn't think that would be something important to consider, but that actually does help. As I said, better soil quality, and it also reduces the compaction of soil because people aren't like stepping on it all the time like how they would with an in-ground garden. Only cons, materials can be a little expensive, and like the actual like putting them together is kind of labor intensive. But other than that, like other than the cost of materials, like raised bed gardening is, if you have the outdoor space for it, is a really, really awesome way to like get started with gardening, and it's very customizable for size and everything. And then finally, container gardening, which is, this is one of like the, actually, so container gardening, is just like planting in pots. It can be indoors and outdoors, which is a really awesome element to it. Doesn't need a lot of space, obviously. Usually for vegetables, they need about like 1 cubic foot of space to be like super duper happy, but you can go smaller. It'll just limit the size of your plant. It's also got like just a small footprint. It doesn't require a lot of resources, a lot of like energy input. Only cons, it does require maybe a little bit more attention because like while it requires like less resources overall, it's like less resources but like more frequent resources. Pots can be a little expensive, and the pot size, again, if it isn't like a cubic foot, does limit the growth of like your vegetable plant. So that is what I've got for the different kinds of gardens, like primarily. We're hoping to do something more specific into like small space gardening for indoors in particular, especially for us, our people that live in like apartments or dorms, don't have outdoor space. Moving forward, we're hoping to like apply some of these alternative methods in our aquaponics committee, like Aaliyah's been touching on, as well as if you would like to try your hand at container gardening, our event on not this Saturday, but next Saturday, you can again bring your recyclable container. We'll supply you with the materials and you can leave with an herb plant, and it'll be a great like way to, I guess, like start your indoor garden if you're interested. We're also looking to shift responsibility for garden management to be a more like communal thing. So if you're interested in that, definitely hit us up. But that is all of my presentation. And so now I would just like to open it. Any questions, any comments, any corrections, hit me.
What's something I can do indoors, like in this time period of the year?
It
That would be
depends
good.
on what you're looking for. Do you want something like a decorative plant, or do you want something that can yield like a crop?
If there's something that could yield a crop, that would be awesome.
This time of year in a controlled space, probably herbs are your best bet. You just have to be careful with temperature and humidity. Easiest way is once you're done germinating, right? So going from seeds to actual little sprouts, keeping it maybe with like a bottle over top of it or some kind of like saran wrap just to keep the humidity levels. I know at least in my dorm, it's really cold. So some of my plants are suffering from that. So I'm trying to like keep them humid, keep them misted, keep them moist because they dry out and it's cold. But that's kind of the easiest thing to do. Otherwise, doing plants that like flowers you can grow that can be turned into tea, like chamomile plants. They're essentially daisies. That's a really easy one to do. I believe lavender is another one. I'm not sure about the growing season of lavender though. So don't quote me on that. And then otherwise, if crops aren't your jam, you could always try succulents. You could try houseplants. You just, again, need to be mindful of what their needs are, their temperatures, what sunlight they need. Or if you want to be crazy like me, you can try to germinate things out of season. I didn't steal, they're free. They were on my backyard. I'm sorry, let me correct myself. In my backyard back home in my driveway, there's a ton of morning glories. So I took a bunch of seeds from there because it's cold season. So now they're just starting to drop seeds. So I'm hoping at least in this winter, I can start to germinate them because maybe, hey, my living room in my dorm will have a jungle in it and it'll just be morning glories because they're one of my favorite flowers. So if you want to be crazy, you want to experiment, feel free, do it. Just put the time and put the effort. And it's a learning experience. It's a lot of research, but you can only know if you experience.
Yeah, I like the tea idea. That's good.
Yeah, definitely. That was something I found out like today for a friend. Chamomile is not that hard to grow, and it's like maybe like a week to a week and a half of germination time. And then literally tea is just you drying out the flowers, and it's cold season, so you could just dry them out really easily.
Yeah, and hopefully like after the event, if you want to come and like start your own herb garden, like on the Discord channel, like we can set up like a message group or something of people that attended, like share some tips and tricks, or like, yo, my herb is not sprouting, like what do I do? Or like, so because it'll be my first time like container gardening herbs. So I don't know if it's your first time too, Jake, but we might be in the same boat. But yeah, little container garden for us.
And the success rate isn't always guaranteed either. That's why I say it's a learning process, because you could plant things and do everything perfectly and it just might not work. Sometimes seeds just aren't in it. So if that happens to you a lot and seeds just aren't your jam, then maybe you need to upgrade and get seedlings where they're already grown. It's kind of less likely for them to just die on you because they're already grown, they're already established. And then you just move them, relocate them, monitor them, and they're good to go. That's what we did for a lot of our crops. And at least the start of summer when we did our seedlings.